purpose of today's meeting is to once again reflect on where we've come since 2010. We established this convening, and we thought about the status of women in higher education leadership, and we examined the data, and we thought about reasonable ways to impact the data. And in 2014, we established 4 goals, and you'll see those outlined in your folder. We decided that we had admired the problem enough, and that if someone was going to take action, it had to be us. So we have had this convening now, and I think we've had upwards of 70 people at some of the convenings. We have had over 120 volunteers around the nation who came together and focused on one of the 4 goals and helped us move forward. And so I want to publicly thank them for their efforts as well. And many of them are not here today, but they remain committed to this effort, and they did express their regrets for not being here today. Last year, at this convening, we came together and decided we need to launch a call to action. Now that we had the 4 goals, we had all of our energy in one direction. We have our ACE women's networks around the nation speaking the same language about how we need to advance women, and that is significant, that we're all saying the same thing and we mean the same thing. That's huge. So we had the call to action in December of 2015. And that started out with the goal of having 100 presidents and chancellors, men and women across the nation, to sign on to the commitment to advance women leaders in higher education, to advance an inclusive group of women leaders in higher education. And today we stand with 380 presidents and chancellors, men and women around the nation who have signed on. So that applause should be for yourselves, because it was you who have done the great work. So today, the purpose of this convening, we have shifted from our 4 goals to engaging those signers in a meaningful way to help them to live up to the commitment. And today is also an opportunity to expand our scope and expand our partnerships and hear from other leaders of organizations that have been involved in creating a movement to advance change and inclusion. And so today we're going to start off with our speaker from Catalyst, but I want to invite Madeline Haynes, Vice President and Chancellor for the Commonwealth campuses from the Pennsylvania State University, to introduce our first presenter. Thank you, Madeline.
Okay, we're good. It is logistics.
Stage managing.
I am. It's my pleasure to introduce our first featured speaker this morning. Jan Cambopiano is the Senior VP, Vice President for Research and Chief Knowledge Officer at Catalyst, Inc. Jan co-leads Catalyst's research program, and in this capacity is responsible for overseeing the development of breakthrough research to empower leaders and organizations to create inclusive workplaces. Jan leads the applied research efforts of Catalyst and heads its information center that provides knowledge, insights for Catalyst supporter organizations, the media, and scholars. In addition, Jan leads the knowledge management efforts, all of them for Catalyst, creating publicly available content and maintaining Catalyst knowledge infrastructure. In her 16 years at Catalyst, Jan has brought a breadth and depth of expertise in women's history, women's leadership, global trends, inclusion, and organizational change, and she shares her expertise widely as an author and as a sought-after speaker on the global market. Jan holds a bachelor's in American history and a master's in women's history from SUNY Binghamton, and holds a master's of library science from SUNY Albany. So on a personal note, a group of us that led by Kim and Lynn met Jan and Catalyst's president and CEO, Deb Gillis, in New York this past December, and the conversation was nothing short of electric. So much common ground, so much common interest to generate and disseminate critical information, critical insights about the effects of women's participation on decision-making bodies and serving in key leadership posts in global corporate and government sectors. The effects are powerful and make for a compelling case for a gender-diversified leadership. Admittedly, we entered the conversation with tremendous bias. We have been borrowing Catalyst's findings, citing its good social research to inform our initial goal to raise awareness for moving the needle and to create a sense of urgency for advancing women leaders in our own sector, the American Academy. So we came to the conversation to invite Catalyst here to our summit and to find ways to leverage our common interests, and this is a great first step. Full disclosure, we have drawn, I think, a sense of our strength of conviction from the demonstrated good revealed from Catalyst and other private sector organizational studies that document the benefits of women's leadership and the benefits of inclusive leadership in advancing the productivity, the financial success, innovation, and social reputation of organizations. And these findings, I think, gave us a foundation of confidence when we set this otherwise audacious goal to create or to realize parity with women holding at least 50% of chief executive positions in higher education by the year 2030. We are at 26%. So as the case is with dynamic organizations that have a successful track record as change agents and an entrepreneurial spirit, Catalyst has more recently pivoted its mission to focus on accelerating women's progress through workplace inclusion. And Jan will talk today about Catalyst's strategies to create sustainable change at all levels of organizations. We are so happy to have Jan with us today. Thank you for being here. I think we're good.
Okay.
You're all good now.
Okay.
Make sure
Okay, all good. Thank you so much for having me. I want to take a step back and say what happened in Orlando also affected all of us because it's about society and about what we value as a society. And what I'm going to talk about today is a way we could become an inclusive society. It's not just in our workplaces, but it's in our communities as well. So the name of my talk is Making Inclusion Achievable. I'm a very much a rah-rah, optimistic person, and I think it is achievable. It's going to take effort. It is not going to become a miracle, and we're suddenly going to have all to really work at. As Madeline said, we at Catalyst have been working on women in the workplace since we were founded in 1962. I'm going to give you a little history.
Can you talk a little louder?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to stand over here because I feel like I'm going to walk off the stage.
I won't let you.
But is that good? Is it louder?
Just to make sure.
Sorry. Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. I call myself a Felice fangirl because Felice Schwartz founded Catalyst because she wanted women to be able to go back into the workplace even after becoming mothers. That was not the norm in the 50s. It was not the norm in the early 60s. But she thought women had something to offer and that the United States as a society would be better off if women participated in the economy and in the workforce. So for the first 25 years of our organization, we really helped women get into the workplace. We helped them choose college majors beyond education and nursing. We helped women interview or create resumes. We focused on board directors to show that women could have role models and make it to the top. But after 25 years of basically encouraging women to lean in, there wasn't really that much change. And so we shifted our focus to look at the systemic issues, the systems and processes that were in workplaces. We started doing consulting. We started doing research about talent management and how women got ahead. And last year, we decided to shift once again and say, you know what, it's not just individuals making choices or organizations having systems, but how they interact. And so our pivot in changing our mission to accelerating progress for women through workplace inclusion is us saying inclusion is both the method and the outcome we want to see. It's not enough to just have women in leadership if you don't have inclusion. You're not going to have a sustainable pipeline of women. You're not going to have a real change in the workplace. You're just going to shift one group for another without change. And the way in which we're going to do this is through 4 strategies. The first is a focus on breakthroughs. We're sick of incremental change. Today, we've released our 2015 census, and big surprise, women are still not 20% of board directors in the S&P 500. So it went up from 19.2% last year to 19.9%. That's not that much of a change. We're going to continue to see these small steps forward without doing something different. That's what a breakthrough is. We also want to amplify our global impact and not just think about boots on the ground. We're a global organization. We have offices in the US and Canada and Europe, India, Australia, and Japan. But we want everyone in every country in the world to know who we are and to know about our mission and to know about this work about inclusion. So we started doing different programs, including our MOOC, Catalyst X, about inclusive leadership, that I can talk about more later. But over 200 countries and territories are represented, and over 170,000 people around the world have taken that course. That's about us trying to create inclusive societies. We also want to lead a movement because we want to create a community of champions. We want people to actually say they are inclusive leaders, and they want other people to be inclusive leaders as well. And of course, because change starts at home, we want to role model this ourselves. So for us, we changed our performance management system to have inclusive leadership as one of the core competencies. And we judge ourselves to that same standard. In the lower right here, you can see the outcomes. For a long time, as a research organization, we were really focused on shifting mindsets. We wanted people to know. We were all about knowledge. I am all about knowledge. I want people to know things, but it's not enough. We want people to actually change their behavior. Actions speak louder than words. So that's what we're focused on now. There's a lot written about unconscious bias and organizations doing unconscious bias training. This is a little controversial statement for me, but I'm going to say there's a lot of unintended consequences of this. And I'm going to talk about them, and I refer to them sort of like the 5 stages of grief. First, you have denial. People are like, that's not me, that's somebody else. Or you have anger. Hey, wait a second. If everyone is biased, that means they're biased against me, and that's not fair. Or people are like, wait a second. All of these biases are not the same. Trying to equate them to being all the same, not fair. Third is bargaining. Everyone is biased, so it's okay. Fourth is depression. Everyone is biased and there's nothing we can do about it. So people just feel paralyzed. And the fifth is acceptance. Wow, there are biases everywhere, and it's good to know, and it's good for me to know, because I need to do something about it. There's not enough people who get to that acceptance stage. I was being kind of facetious there, but I want you to think about unconscious bias and unconscious bias training like it's a 12-step program. You're going to have to do it for the rest of your life, but you don't have to think about it that way. You just have to think about it. I'm not going to be biased this day, or I'm going to try not to be biased in this meeting, or when I speak to this person. It's one interaction at a time. Because it's about actions, behaviors are really the key indicators of inclusion. What we've been talking about most recently is really making the connection between the what, our mission, accelerating progress for women through workplace inclusion, and the how, leading a movement of individuals, organizations, policymakers, in demonstrating inclusive behaviors and creating inclusive workplaces with this middle and what we're calling the inclusion story. And that is, what is it we believe about inclusion, and how can we get other people to believe what we believe? When we talk about inclusion, our research really comes up with this handy-dandy formula here, which seems very simple. It basically is belongingness, that you get a sense that you have common ground with other people, and the perception that you are unique. And both of those work together, and that makes inclusion. And that sounds awesome and really great, but what does it mean? And it means that we're all recognized as individuals. We're not fungible. You're not the same as someone else, and what you bring is valuable. But it also means that you have common ground with other people. Even if you're different, there's something about it that you can connect with someone else. It means that I exist, you exist, we exist, and us exist all at the same time. When you think about it this way, if you have too much individuality and too little common ground, it's chaos. If you have too little individuality and too much common ground, you might be in a cult. Just telling you. Be on the lookout for that one. People like to talk about uniqueness like snowflakes. All snowflakes are different. I grew up in upstate New York. I do not like snow, so I don't like that analogy. So I think about it as a garden. Inclusion is a garden. Uniqueness is all the different plants that are in that garden, all the individuals that are there. Teams are those sections of the garden. This section has a waterfall. This section has a bench. This section has the stone wall. And the organization is really the climate where that garden is. What's the soil like? What's the temperature? What's the availability of water? Some of those things you can change, but you need to know that you need them. If you're in a desert and you want to grow really thirsty plants like roses, you need to give it more water. It's not going to come from the sky. So that's what we're talking about, being aware of what you need and what is needed for people to thrive. The problem is that inclusion really isn't well understood. The part that's pretty much everyone can point to is exclusion, because it's visceral. People really feel that, and they hold on to it. Bad experiences people remember. We refer to it as the death by 1,000 cuts. It's all those micro inequities of somebody forgetting your name or mentioning someone else's name and not your name just because they happen to be the same race as you. Or it could be something like being what we would call a slate sitter, somebody who always gets chosen to be part of the pool for the next job. But guess what? They never get chosen for that next job. So the first couple of times it happens to them, they feel great. I might get this job. It's exciting. The next few times they're like, oh, it's not going to happen. And then as it continues to go on, they know it's not going to happen, and they realize they're just a token and they're not valued. Part of this is the experience of otherness. Everybody has felt like an other one time or another. It might be because of your gender, it might be because of your race, ethnicity, it might be because of your age, your religion, nationality, your accent, anything. This could be people visit the island of otherness, but some people live there. Their entire experience is about being an other. I'm going to give you an example of that for women. We did research a number of years ago about the double bind, and it's about the narrow set of behaviors that women have to demonstrate in the workplace. The first is kind of like the Goldilocks dilemma. She can't be too tough or too soft. She can only be just right. That is very hard to navigate on a daily basis. The second is kind of like the superwoman dilemma. She can't just be good. She's got to be awesome. She's got to be amazing. She's got to be wonderful and prove that she can do this. We have research that shows that men are more likely to get promoted on potential. People have confidence in their ability, but women have to show proof of performance. And the last one is sort of accumulation of all of that is she can't just be awesome. She also has to be likable. That's difficult. You're trying to do all of these things all the time. It's very stressful. It's hard. And sometimes what people end up doing is they end up covering in the workplace. They hide aspects of themselves because they just can't deal with it. They can't deal with other people's reactions to themselves. And that happens to people every day. Little tip, that's not an inclusive workplace when people are constantly hiding themselves. So the cost to the organization of all this exclusion is, a loss of productivity, of innovation, and within teams, it's a lot of inefficiencies of work. People don't trust each other, they don't work well together. And on an individual basis, it could be like stress and burnout and health issues because you're constantly trying to navigate all of these issues. And people pay for it every day. Again, dose of reality. Just because exclusion is gone doesn't mean inclusion is magically going to appear. Inclusion is kind of difficult. It's an intangible. It's like oxygen. We don't notice it, we don't think about it, but damn, when it's gone, you can't breathe. You're going to die. So you notice its absence more than you notice its presence. The other thing about it is it's not a constant state of being. In the morning, you might feel really included. You're working with a great team. You're working with people who really make you feel good. But then one little thing happens, and it just throws you off. So it's not realistic to expect it's going to be perfect all the time. But that's why behavior changes are key. If you can change people's behaviors, you can change their attitudes. It's harder to change people's attitudes than it is to change their behaviors. And we know that based on research about habits. People form habits, new habits, in days, weeks, months. But it might take decades for someone to really change their attitude. When you think about a habit, sometimes it's a positive habit. I will always put my keys by the door. Sometimes it's a negative. For me, I'll just share this. I found out I'm allergic to corn. I cannot have any kind of corn product. I didn't really care. I didn't really eat Fritos or Doritos or anything like that. But I have to look and be like, no, I can't. Or if I don't know what's in something, I have to say no. That's a hard habit, but I have one. And it's something people can do. Behaviors are changeable. You can reinforce behaviors. You can let people You can help people with them. They're a lot easier than trying to shift their thinking. This is sort of our next draft about the story of inclusion. And it's the way to get there. And it's really talking about inclusion is workplaces that work for everyone. And so that means everyone has to participate in that, making that workplace work for everyone. And it starts with a shared vision. I heard this statement last week at a meeting, which is, how do you know you're in an inclusive environment? And that is, exclusion is consistently disrupted and inclusion is dependably reinforced or affirmed. So you just have to ask yourself about behaviors, about processes, about practices. Is this affirming inclusion or disrupting exclusion? It narrows it down for you. It helps you make decisions. The second, and we just talked about this a little, inclusion is not just professional, it's personal, because it's about people. And so it's about developing a shared commitment. This is something we do in our Marked Leaders program, which is Men Advocating Real Change. It talks about privilege, and we try to make it be something that people can get behind. It's not your fault the system is like this, but it's your responsibility to change it. And when I say your, I mean all of us. It's not just men's responsibility to change it. It's not just women's responsibility to change it. It's all of us together. So you want a shared commitment. And then the last is you can actually make changes by establishing norms, goals, and expectations. And that's all about shared accountability. You want to reinforce equality, and that means a visibility of opportunity, and you want to disrupt all those patterns of exclusion that you see. That's basically what we're talking about, is having a shared vision about what inclusion is, having a shared commitment to make it a reality, and creating shared accountability mechanisms so we can all reinforce the behaviors we want to see. I'm going to talk really quickly about what inclusive leadership is. We use a handy-dandy acronym each to talk about this, and it basically is these four behaviors. It's empowerment. It's showing people that you believe in them and that you give them the tools to get their work done and that you have their back. They can count on you. It's about accountability. You're making expectations clear, you're holding people to shared standards, and you're actually talking with them about what's working and what's not working. We see a lot in our research that women are less likely to get feedback, and women of color are even less likely to get feedback. And that hurts them. If you cannot give people feedback, they cannot grow. The C is for courage, and it's about you forging connections with other people by sharing pieces of yourself. And it's about flipping this whole idea about vulnerability. Being vulnerable is a strength. It allows you to find common ground with other people. The H is for humility, and it's about having an open and a growth mindset. It's about being able to ask for help when you need it. And it's basically about letting people know that you're human. You have failabilities, you have struggles, you have issues. People can understand who you are as a person. When you have all four of those behaviors, it lets people know that they matter. And when they know they matter, what we've seen in our research is they care about other people, so they have higher levels of team citizenship behaviors. They will help others in return. It's a virtuous cycle. And they're also more innovative because they feel like they can share and learn from other people. A lot of talking. I had to have a water break. Uniqueness and belongingness really play out in teams, however, and that's the way most work happens. Inclusion is the antidote to being marginalized in the workplace. When teams value everyone and they value their contributions and they disrupt those patterns of exclusion, which is that death by 1,000 cuts, productivity rises. And there's some really quick ways to do that within a team. I'm going to give you an example. One is about meeting norms. What are the ground rules for a meeting? Today in the HBR Daily, they mentioned one that was to help everyone stay on task in a meeting. You give everyone a safe word. Their example was jellyfish. So if somebody feels like the meeting is going off track, someone can just say, hey, wait a second, jellyfish moment here. Can we get back? And it allows people to be able to speak up. You tell people it's okay to speak up and tell us we're off track. Sometimes people need that permission. They need to know that it's okay to do something. You can also establish team norms. One of the consulting firms we work with does something they call PTO, predictability, teaming, open communication. Before they actually start a project, their first meeting is all about people saying, you know what, I can't travel on weekends. I don't have childcare. I can't work Wednesday nights. I have to go to school or whatever it is. They decide and let everyone know how they can work. What are their norms around responding to emails? When are they going to pick up the phone and call each other? When are they going to have meetings that are face-to-face? They discuss all that before they start working. And they have people to help them go through that if they're getting off track. So that's a great way to have a little bit of an intervention there. The reason all of these things work, inclusive leadership, having shared norms, is it leads to psychological safety, which means people are not wasting their time overcompensating or covering who they are, can be paying attention to what's going on at work. And psychological safety really is about these four things. It's about allowing people to take risks. It's about making sure they have voice and can speak up. It's making sure they're not paralyzed and afraid to do anything because they're so afraid to do the wrong thing that they won't make a mistake because they're afraid of the consequences. And it also shows that trust is possible. People can have both reliance, trust. I can count on you to do whatever it is you're saying you're going to do. And they can have disclosure, trust. I'm okay sharing this about myself that I need you to know. And if people are feeling safe, then they're not wasting their time trying to protect themselves. When we talk about organizations, so we've talked about individuals, we've talked about teams, we're talking about organizations, which are basically the systems that either hinder or help inclusion. And when you have formal systems and processes and practices that match the informal norms and expectations of behaviors, and that they're all working in a way to help people be recognized as people and to contribute, then you're doing something good. And it's hard because you have to evaluate what is valued. Is there a disconnect between what's in the written policy and actually what people do? Who is valued? Are there people who act in extreme ways, somebody who yells in meetings or chastises people in public, but they still get rewarded with the next job? That's a disconnect about inclusion. When you're trying to create systems and processes that intentionally disrupt bias, there are great examples in different types of industries. One is orchestras. So orchestras in the 70s and 80s decided that they were going to do blind auditions. Orchestras is about musicians. It's about music. It shouldn't be about the person and the gender of the person. But up until the 80s, most orchestras in the US were heavily, heavily male and really heavily white male. Once they started doing blind auditions, that shifted because they got to pay attention to what was important, and that was the music. One of the things they're doing most recently is not just having people perform behind a screen, but having people walk across the stage with someone else. So you can't tell whether that person's a woman or a man, because a woman and a man are always walking across the stage together. And it's not always just having a policy. Sometimes it's just thinking about what you can do. In the UK, for example, they're doing blind resumes. They're stripping people's names so they can look at people's skills and not have that be influencing what they're doing. There's a lot of policies out there, though, and people use them, but they don't always use them to the best of their ability. And one example of that is paternity leave. A lot of organizations have paternity leave, but not a lot of men in this country actually take paternity leave as much as they could. And the reason they don't is because of stereotypes and because of norms. What are you going to do? I'm sorry I don't remember his name, but last year when a baseball player decided he was going to take a couple of days off at the beginning of the baseball season, remember that? He got slammed in sports media. What are you going to do? What are you going to do, just hang around the hospital all day? He's going to be with his wife and his newborn child. Is that not a good thing? So we have all of these norms in society that we do have to break through and think about, and those norms in society actually reflect in people's workplaces. It's hard to imagine a man saying, I need to take 3 months if no one else has ever taken 3 months before. Being that first person to say, I need to do this, even though that's what it is. But he could be that first person if he has the backing of his team, if he has the backing of his boss, if he has the backing of other people. That's what inclusive leadership is about. It's not a position. Anyone can be an inclusive leader, but it's about creating that community of people who think like you do. So I'm going to end this with reinforcing this message that inclusion is achievable if you start with a shared vision, you start with a shared commitment, and you start with shared accountability. We are never going to have change if people don't do anything. Inertia is powerful, so let's do something.
We're going to take some questions. We have a few minutes. We have about 5. Question, could you stand up, please, and so we can hear you? And
Go back to the H.
the H screen. To discuss?
Actually, take a picture of it.
Oh.
No problem.
Well, I think we'll get this PowerPoint.
Yeah, if you want the PowerPoint, I can.
Yeah, why don't
I
we
can
make
share
that
it.
agreement? Being part of this summit is to get all access to PowerPoints. There you have it. Questions? Comments? Yeah, Rusty.
Thank you for your presentation. I think these are all important points, but I still have some issues about the uniqueness part of the presentation. And while I agree there needs to be common goals that we all achieve, it's not clear to me how you maintain individual group identity, which I think is really important. Because I think it gets lost in the shuffle oftentimes because there is this common goal. And what's not clear is, for example, from the Native communities, they may look at issues differently, even though there's this common goal that creates all kinds of issues. And because when I hear you speak, it feels like it's a monolithic kind of approach, and I don't think that's your intent. And I think that's where the uniqueness comes out. But I'm still not sure how difference within the group of women play out, because there are differences, even in terms of establishment of the common authorities. And I think we need to look at that very carefully. It's not impossible.
We might want to try to capture the context of Rusty's
Yeah, so the question really is about how do you have individual group identity and maintain that within groups. And it is difficult. It is hard. One of the more recent pieces of research actually looked at hockey teams. Stay with me here. But when people were very similar, they came from the same background, they came from the same country, they had the similar kind of training, things were good because they all had common ground. When they were kind of a mix, there were a big group of people who had common ground, came from the same country, had the same kind of training, and then there were a whole bunch of people who had difference. It was difficult because there was a lot of diversity. When absolutely everybody came from a different country, had different training, they were good. They were similar to the people who only had common ground because they were forced to find that common ground with each other and recognize what everyone brought. And so part of that is starting from that place of I'm different like you, and I want to learn from you. So it starts with this personal idea that just because we're women doesn't mean we're the same. There are more differences between women than there are between women and men, for example. But it starts with that idea that you're going to acknowledge that differences exist and you want to learn from them. And I think that's part of where we've been having all of these struggles with inclusion, because people are like, oh, they're just women here, so they don't need to find out differences among them. They don't need to talk about anything. You can't represent your whole group. Just because you're part of a group doesn't mean everyone in that group feels like you do. And so I think that is an important start to that kind of difference and acknowledging it, because uniqueness is about individuals. Everyone is different. People might have different opinions. You might have different political beliefs. You might have different religious beliefs, moral beliefs even living next door to someone and being part of the same background. And so it's how can you actually recognize those? So I will be careful in the future not to suggest that everybody is the same in that uniqueness. Thank you.
Jan, I'm sorry if you could take this model and tell us, how does this directly link to your research? Did you generate this model or this paradigm based on the research that you had done? Or have you actually tested this model against data that you've collected and you can actually see that this kind of structure does help to encourage inclusion?
Yeah, so the question was about the EACH model and how we got the EACH model. So the EACH model is based upon servant leadership, if you're familiar with that term. And what we've done is we have tested this in, the original study was in 6 countries around the world, in the US, Mexico, Germany, Australia, India, and China. And what we found is this works in all of those. That whole notion of uniqueness, belongingness resonates. So inclusion is global. It resonates. It might resonate in slightly different ways. For example, in India, they feel like uniqueness and belongingness are pretty much 2 sides of the same coin, so they're not really distinct. You're both different and part of the group. And maybe that's because of thousands of years of diversity that's within Indian culture. We're doing a study right now in Japan, which is taking this model and doing it on a team basis. So teams, like people who are in like probably 5 to 10 person groups, and whether this works. So I can send you the research that we've done. It's available on our website, but it has been tested and we've seen it. And like I said, what we saw were when leaders demonstrated all 4 of these attributes, their direct reports said that they felt closer to their teams, they were more willing to help other people, and they self-reported higher levels of innovation.
The reason I asked is this reminds me very much of Jim Collins' work on level 5 leadership and some of the emotional intelligence work that's been done before. And so that, if you've actually tested that, you can see that this kind of approach does enhance inclusion. I think that's a really valuable link to make, which is a link that I have not seen before.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Rusty, and then let's go over here, and then we'll come back. Yes.
You briefly mentioned sustaining
Mm-hmm.
inclusion at work. What does the research, if there is any, what does the research show about sustaining inclusion at work? I guess what I'm wondering is does it seem to be difficult is there any cases where it slips back to a non-inclusive environment, or is there any research on that?
So the question was about sustaining inclusion and whether there's research about how do you really sustain it and whether people slip back. And I would say everyone's always going to slip back. That's human nature. And the same thing is true whether you have an initiative in a company. It's really hard to sustain it over a long period of time. But one of the things we've seen and I would use this as part of the research, is through our Catalyst Award, where we're examining cultures that recruit, develop, and advance women. Over the last probably like 15 years, they've been more focused on culture change and what's been happening within the organization. And what we've seen is when the entire organization is involved in that culture change, from the CEO, the board, the senior leaders, the middle managers, the first line managers, the employees themselves, that's been sustaining. When it's just been a top-down approach, as soon as that person at the top leaves, things fall apart. So that's why it comes back to this community. If you can organize it around everyone being involved and everyone having this shared commitment and feeling responsible for that culture, you will see more sustainable. Because when one person falls back, other people are there to catch them, more people are there to jump on, and then you can have more sustained momentum.
Let's have Rusty and then Connie, and then I think we need to call it a morning.
It's just a technical thing. When you talked about the 4 leaders in terms of the criteria, the whatever they needed to be successful, I'm assuming they've had some previous training to bring them to the point. Because the reason I say that, this institution shall remain nameless, but I remember a female chair of feminists came to me to say that she was bringing in 4 women of color to her department. And my question to her was, that's terrific, or my response was terrific, are you ready for them?
Mm-hmm.
And she said, they're scholars. They shared a common goal, they're scholars. By November, she was in my office crying because the conversation changed within the department. And she said, they don't appreciate what I've done for them. Even though this was a fairly progressive person, it wasn't the kind of statement that I expected. So there needs to be some training of these leaders, right, these supervisors, which I'm assuming there is.
Yeah, so I can give you a quickie commercial for the 3 types of training that we do. We do the online training, that's for everyone, the MOOCs, that's available right now, self-paced. Go to edX, look up Catalyst X, all of those training programs in there. We do small group training in person. It's called Leading with Inclusion. That's really aimed at middle managers and helping them understand how to be an inclusive leader themselves, how to be an inclusive leader for a team, how to communicate inclusively, a whole bunch. There's 6 different modules there. And then we do MARC leaders, Men Advocating Real Change, but that's for women and men, not just for men, for top leadership teams. That is more focused on this idea about getting shared commitment. It's about understanding your privilege. You know, it's not you benefiting other people or graciously giving someone an assignment or something. It's an experiential learning program, so people get to understand their own privilege and understand more about it. And for that program, it's we have like a half-day session, and we have a day-and-a-half session. For the day-and-a-half session, what we generally hear from everyone is they come out of that room changed. They start thinking about things they've never changed and start experiencing things. So I'm with you. In order to have leaders that can really demonstrate these, they need help. They need to understand where they are coming from and what inclusive leadership looks like to them.
So last question or comment from Connie?
Well, it relates, thank you, that's really helpful, and I'm interested in the different levels of leadership president or one this or one that, and they can only do so much. So to truly make a difference that is sustained across the institution, how do other people within other levels of the organization model this as well?
So inclusive leadership is for everyone. All four of these ideas, empowerment, accountability, courage, humility, have an aspect you can do when you don't directly control someone else's work. It's about influencing other people in a positive way. So when you're empowering people, but you can't actually give them an assignment, it looks different than if you're the president and you're giving someone an opportunity. Empowering might look different, but it's the same kind of piece of you're helping someone be successful. You're doing your part to help them be successful. The same thing with accountability. You might not have the power to write their performance review, but you have the power to help them understand what are shared norms. Like I just mentioned the piece about the meeting norms. Something that we hear about quite often is after people have the training, we actually do a training about meetings, how to run an inclusive meeting. And people feel like, I went to so-and-so and I talked to them about their behavior in this meeting. They talked over people. They didn't acknowledge when women spoke. And they ended up talking to them in a really positive, helpful way, not shaming them, not castigating them, castigating them. And what they got is they were like, I'm going to have your back. I'm going to help you. And that person ended up displaying courage and humility and saying, I need your help. Sit next to me in the next meeting. Write notes to me. And so it is about you deciding for yourself what you need to do in that moment, in that interaction. Inclusion is about the interactions you have every day and the choices you make to make them inclusive or not. So that's what that's about.
Okay, do we have time for one more, Kim? All right, you're lucky, Lolo.
Thank you.
Last one.
Grateful. Okay. Could I ask you to show the safety slide, because I'm very interested in that concept? The next one? Okay, so this is actually something I'm struggling with right now, is you talked about this as a model that is to apply for both in the workplace and in the community.
Mm-hmm.
My concern is I know that there'll be a lot of people in the community who won't be taking this PowerPoint session. So how have you found that you manage feelings of safety or concerns about safety that are because of I live in another world outside the workplace, and that's still part of who I am and what I bring and show up with at work? So does that make sense that there might be still things that happen to me where I don't feel safe because of my other experiences, and then I come into a workplace where that might be the only place I'm getting at? I don't know if that's
Right, and so,
articulating that.
yeah, so I think part of the question about psychological safety is people don't just exist as workers. They exist as people. They have lives outside of there. They have experiences that got them to this place. And part of psychological safety is getting people into a space where they feel like they can share that experience with someone else. So it's about building trust with them on that reliance, disclosure, trust, because people are not going to do it. They're not going to share why they feel this way, why they're always doubting when you say something's going to happen. And something we have seen, because we do the MOOC, the Catalyst Acts, that's aimed at everyone around the world, is we've heard from people who've taken that course and used it in the community. People have talked about using it with their church group. People have talked about it using it with their parent-teacher association or something like that, and being able to have that be a marker. And so it's about you being a person, recognizing you bring something to that workplace that is not just about you as a worker. And if you can't get to that place, that's also an indication that something probably needs to get looked at.
Okay, so we want to thank Jan very much. If it pleases the group, we will get the PowerPoint to everyone. And Jan, if you could help us with some of the, navigating your website so that we can get hold of those wonderful studies. That's very kind.
Thank you again, Jan. For our next session, I'd like to welcome Margaret Jugovich, President of Hartwick College, and she's going to take us into our next session.
Jan, on behalf of all of us, let me thank you again for bringing those ideas to bear this morning. You know, listening to you reminds me that change comes at the hands of many actors, and sometimes individual efforts combine to create a collective effort like moving the needle, which really advances ideas, but always we return to the individuals like you and now to Cyrus who inspire us to take these ideas forward, and so I'm grateful to you. We're very pleased, I'm very pleased to have the privilege of introducing Cyrus Mary. Much of Cyrus's work has been aimed at systematically and remedying discrimination, improving opportunities for many, including women, and bettering corporate behavior, which is part of the creating the environment that Jan spoke about. Cyrus is a founding partner of Marian Scallett in Washington, D.C. He litigates cases involving discrimination, civil and consumer rights violations, and corporate fraud. His impact has been documented in such places as the New York Times, which has said, and I quote, "Mr. Mary's vision for corporate America involves sweeping change, not the piecemeal kind." He's led and co-led some of the largest and most significant race and gender cases in U.S. history. And a couple of those are provided in his bio that you have in front of you, but I wanted to point out in particular the Robinson versus Ford Motor Company, which resulted in 279 apprenticeship positions for African-American employees and a $10 million payment, as well as lasting implications for testing protocols in industry. And again, this is an example that these and other settlements really point to innovative programmatic relief that seeks to stop discrimination. Particularly interesting perhaps to you is he spearheaded an initiative to expose long-running gender inequity. The Women on Wall Street project, which he launched with the National Council of Women's Organizations, sought to end discrimination against women in the financial institutions, and you know many of them. And he achieved settlements during this project with Morgan Stanley, with Smith Barney, with Wachovia, exceeding $114 million, while transforming the opportunities available to women on Wall Street. He extended that to the Madison Avenue project, which Cyrus launched with the NAACP, releasing a seminal report on employment discrimination in the advertising industry. And maybe he's most well known for his work on advancing equal opportunity in professional sports, which affected change both in the U.S. and abroad after he and Johnny Cochran Jr. co-wrote the study Black Coaches in the National Football League, Superior Performance, Inferior Opportunities. The NFL adopted what is called the Rooney Rule, a comprehensive diversity program under which the NFL has reached historical numbers of black management personnel. And as I shared with Cyrus, as I sat in an NCAA Division III President's Council meeting just the other day in Indianapolis, people were talking about the Rooney Rule. And so this has had a really lasting impact. The one thing you will not see on the bio that you have is that he is a proud, I'm sure, graduate of Hartwick College. And so we need to get that fixed on his resume. But I am, Cyrus is a liberally trained thought leader. And I'm so proud to introduce him to you this morning. Cyrus Mary.
Thank you, Margaret, and I am a very proud Hartwick alum, and I can't tell you, I've seen a lot of college presidents we've had over the years. We've never had anyone better than Margaret. I am so grateful as a member of the alumni that she's our college president, and she not only is a tireless worker, but just brings so much vision and dedication. And I just love her. I just love having her as our college president, and it makes you feel good when you have someone of her caliber leading your college. My remarks will very much build on what Jan has done, except mine will be kind of more from the front lines of our battles with industry and kind of more part of a movement. And it does tie in a lot with the research. But I want to say, like Jan, I kind of start from a very optimistic point of view about where we're going. But I do have to take a moment to mention what happened in Orlando and how sobering and sad that is, and for all the individuals and families affected. And often I wonder how our president, what he must go through all the time, where it seems like every 30 or 60 days he has to go out and console families for what seems to be senseless violence within our country that just keeps escalating. But setting that aside, I feel we're at a very optimistic moment in our history, and I want to touch on some of that. So this struggle I've been kind of part of to try to create equal opportunity, mostly in the big companies, is really just builds on what we are as a country and what our values are. Just the earliest days of our country, the Declaration of Independence, it talks about life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And pursuit of happiness, to me, means that we have to achieve that without artificial barriers based on bias of race or gender and ethnicity and other aspects of people. Another core value of our country is we judge a person by their character, not the color of their skin, as Dr. King pointed out. That's a core value we are as a country. We're a country that talks about equal opportunity, about fair competition. We value upward mobility. So this whole struggle, I think, has to be seen as in that context. And I've been very blessed that I've been able to be a small part of that. Many years ago, Barry Allen Roberts and Syl Chambers, two African-American executives at Texaco, they couldn't find a lawyer willing to take on that big company. And they brought me in to meet with them and a couple other employees at a church in White Plains outside where the company's headquartered. And that was kind of, in a lot of ways, the first race glass ceiling case. And they were the middle managers trying to get up to higher levels. And the data we found was just shocking, how they were treated both individually and systematically. And then we had kind of a lucky gift that came our way, which was that one of the executives, actually an individual who I took his deposition, recorded senior executives shredding the documents in our case that we were subject to a subpoena. And while they were doing that, they were making pejorative comments against blacks and Jews and talking about black jelly beans always at the bottom of the jar and using the N-word and things like that. And that ultimately that information got out, and the New York Times covered it every day for 10 days. It was front page news or in the A section or the business section, and really just elevated that, hey, we're a country that still has these issues, these systemic issues, and there is animus. Fortunately, I think that became a big change in a lot of how corporations see these issues. A lot of companies started bringing diversity and inclusion officers in, and they didn't want to be the next Texaco. And that, I think, started to create some change. And then shortly after that, I started my own firm, and we took on the Coca-Cola company. And there were dozens of individual managers, African-American managers, who came to me, and even though I was just, operating basically out of a suitcase and opening up my doors, that was the first case I took on my own. And the individuals really brought to light the same kind of issues. They may not have had as much animus at Coke. I think it was more negligence, but they valued African-American consumers much more than African-American employees. And then we also brought a historic settlement. Now, both of these settlements, Texaco and Coke, had outside task forces. Coke was chaired by Alexis Herman, the former Secretary of Labor, and Texaco was chaired by Deval Patrick, who later became the governor of Massachusetts. But I also had a central role of carrying out these settlements, and trying to deal with some of the issues Jan's talking about. How do you create real change at these companies? And those lessons I'm going to share with you in a little bit later when I talk about the tools that I think you all could use for moving the needle. And we took on Wall Street in terms of how women are treated, an industry that has been horrendous how they've treated women over the decades. At times it was much more of an openly hostile environment. When our cases came around, it was more of a second generation kind of discrimination. But we found things over those 30 years. And during our negotiations, I can't tell you exactly which company because all of them are confidential. But the defenses, when we showed that, hey, why are the women getting fewer business opportunities than men, we would hear things like essentially that women aren't as good, right? They don't, I call the women don't run as fast defense. But the data didn't support that at all. In fact, women with the same portfolios actually outperformed the men and showed, I think, a lot more, if you look at the data, a lot more customer loyalty, trying to help them get clients get in what's best for them, not what's best for the company. So the data didn't support that. And we even had one negotiation, and you got to remember, the women who choose to be in financial services, they are really go-getter type people who really, want to aspire, make money. But they told us, literally, and a woman said this, well, women just don't want to make as much money as men. And in our room, we had a female mediator, we had 2 women lawyers that were a key part of the team, and just by chance, I brought a paralegal who's aspiring to go to law school as a woman to just say, hey, for your experience, why don't you just sit in on this? The look of horror of all the women on our side when that statement was made, and everyone left, and it was just shocking to hear that, right? And so there's that attitude that's out there. But for all this time, I have to say, in a lot of ways, doing these kind of cases, I felt like, kind of a lonely voice in a lot of ways taking on these companies. Partly because these cases are incredibly hard and very few people want to take them on. But right now, I feel we have the greatest moment to feel optimistic about where we're going. And that's because of what's happening on the college campuses. And it's not just because of great college presidents. I think it's the students, young people today are going to demand change. They're going to demand leadership. And you in this room can help provide that leadership and show the way. So what do we know about college campuses? Well, one, I'll talk about some experiences I had at Hartwick. When I was there, I graduated in 1983. Reagan became president while I was there. It was kind of a peak of apathy, I think, in college campuses. I stood out as an activist, I guess, but and then I just felt like, during my era, people weren't talking about change. They were kind of, accepted where things were in the status quo. I came back, thanks to Margaret, and gave a commencement speech in 2009, right after the economy imploded. And from there, I kind of thought to myself, how do you speak to these students who had the rug pulled out from under them, where they thought that they could go into business and there'd be opportunities, and there's so few. And I kind of wanted to focus on, hey, you have to build your future. You build up the country and you build your future at the same time. You have to find ways to kind of get involved in community service and things like that. And then a few years later, I guess a couple years ago, Margaret brought different alumni together and did a roundtable. And one of the people on the roundtable was one of my classmates, who's a CEO of a major, top 50 company. He was absolutely fascinating, I thought. He was amazing. And I gave my little talk. I felt like it was slightly left of center, slightly anti-corporate, just slightly. But when I was done, all the students wanted to talk to me, and I'm like, don't you want to talk to the CEO right there? He's the guy you should be talking to. And then I spent the day talking to them, and I realized
You know, Barack Obama couldn't win this group necessarily because these students have moved further to the left than what happened in 2008. They had realized that the business community had betrayed their future. They had realized that upward mobility that had been there for decades was being lost. And so it's not a surprise to me that Bernie Sanders is 85% of young people. I felt that when I was on that campus that day. I didn't know Bernie was going to come along, but I felt that someone could come along and really resonate with these people and young people in a different way that's happened in prior times. And so what we see, and you all are seeing it, is a record number of college protests, as documented dozens or hundreds of significant protests. We've seen college presidents being toppled for being tone deaf to what the issues are of the day. But if you look deeper, you will see so much to be really proud of the young people and where we're going. UCLA has done a study, I assume a lot of you might know about it, for almost 50 years, where they study incoming freshmen, okay? And they do an in-depth study. They talked to, this most recent one they did, they went to something like 200,000 students at 200 campuses for this survey. And they see the trends. And what they saw was that this year's freshmen, okay, activism is part of who they are. 97% either participated in a protest as a senior in high school or witnessed one. So that somehow activism was part of their life as a high school senior. And their expectation on college is to be part of some kind of activism at college. And the study that UCLA did showed that there is a record number of students interested in community service and public service. Back in 1983, when I was at Harvard, I might have been the only one, it felt like. You know, I mean, now this is the dominant perspective of young people. That is tremendous for us to think that they care about community service and public service. And that's not the only study. I mean, what are the issues of the day? Obviously, they're seeing issues of kind of the Black Lives Matter issues and, you know, the criminal justice system. They're seeing how women are treated, the sexual assault issues. They care about the cost of higher education. Those are some of the issues. But the bigger point to me is the dedication to community service and public service that you're hearing from them. And it's not just the UCLA study. Peter Hart, the pollster, did a study for the Leon Panetta Institute that he does every year of college students, and they showed very similar kinds of findings. And I've seen it from the experiences I've had on college campuses, speaking in various places as well. So I just think it's there. So what do we have to do as leaders? Okay, I'm very proud of what you all are doing, moving the needle. That you've gotten hundreds of college presidents to sign on to that vision. So now the question is, what have we learned? What tools can we provide, okay? And let me just back up from a broader perspective of what I've seen in kind of trends, data. One of the great things about my job is I get to see the data from a lot of different companies and a lot of different industries, okay? So I'm get to mine what's out there. And here are a few things that you should just know just for corporate America, but that doesn't mean it isn't important for what you're seeing. Take a look at how evaluations are treated in corporate America, okay? And I know that valuations matter where you are in colleges as well. Here's what the data shows that I've seen, and it's very common, okay? Women get equal or higher evaluations than men, and then for some reason they get lower pay. I mean, it is stunning to me. This is supposed to be a meritocracy, and they say we're a meritocracy because we have these evaluations, but somehow the way it gets carried out, women get shortchanged with the same or higher scores as men. That's something to keep an eye on. What my view is that what we're facing, I mean, there's so much focus on the unconscious bias, but I kind of feel like we need to go past that. Because to me, and Jan mentioned it, I find in the struggles that I'm dealing with these companies, it's so easy to get off the hook. Why, hey, we're all got these biases, we don't have to do anything. We got to get past that, because what I think is really going on is, and the science, social science that you see within the academy, there's a lot of research on this issue, which is favoritism. It's much more about favoritism to me than animosity, and it's rewarding people more like yourselves. And the challenges are, how do we overcome those kind of things? A big challenge, huge challenge, is inertia. How do you get institutions to change? Most of the time you're dealing with people of goodwill, right? It's less animosity, more about like, okay, this is an important issue, but what do we have to do about it? So we got to help people find those tools. And someone made a question on the prior session about how do you deal with sustainability. It's very simple. If an organization doesn't have diversity and inclusion in their strategic business plan, it's not going to happen. If you have it in their strategic business plan and you have the mechanisms, and some of them I'm going to outline in a few minutes, that carry out, like Jan was saying, from not just from the CEO, but down to middle management, then you can create the change. So let me give you some ideas that I have for you to consider. Some of which you might say, no, that will never work. Some of which you might say, okay, maybe it'll work. But most of which you're going to have to think about how to tailor it for your setting. As Margaret mentioned, I'm kind of known for the Rooney Rule in the NFL. Let me give you a little bit of background on that and where the challenges are and what the successes have been and where you can go with some of that. Starting with the Coke case, I realized that actually one of the things I ask people when I do an investigation is I'll say to people, where are the stock options given? Like, where does wealth get created? And it's always where the glass ceiling is, okay, in a company. There's a correlation between special compensation like stock options and the glass ceiling. So how do you break through? You have a pipeline of people. How do you break through so people of color or women can get past that glass ceiling where the wealth is created? And so what we came up with in the Koch settlement was just simple requirement, diverse slate. That you have to, every time we define those manager positions, you have to interview a diverse slate of candidates in person, meaningful interviews, so you can make sure you have the best, so you can kind of break through and kind of overcome some of those unconscious biases that are there because you have people right there that are competing and emphasizing fair competition. So we took that idea, the late Johnny Cochran and I, and brought that to the NFL. So what did we do in that report that Margaret mentioned? We looked at the data, the win-loss records of NFL coaches, and then broke it down by race, okay? And we showed that the minority coaches won more games, substantially more games, went to the playoffs twice as often as white counterparts, and yet were like the last hired, first fired. So there's something wrong. There's something about a double standard if you have that kind of data. And we worked with Dr. Janice Madden, who's a labor economist at University of Pennsylvania, and she did the study. But we had to give them a solution. You can't just say you got a problem. And my view was I didn't want to say to them, well, you have to have X number of black coaches by X date, Y date. I said, look, just open up the process. Give these guys a chance to compete. Let them show you what you have to offer. And we had to give them actually written guidelines in the end, because if you just leave it up to the owners, they just, like one owner, Jerry Jones, of course it'd be him, he interviewed Dennis Green by telephone for an hour and Bill Parcells for 2 days in his private airplane or whatever. And we're like, that isn't what we're talking about. What we're talking about is is actual, like, comparable interview process, right? But to their credit, when we made that proposal, it was in September of 2002, Dan Rooney, the chair, the first thing that happened is the owners, Dan Rooney wrote a letter to Commissioner Tagliabue, who's now on the board at Georgetown, and Mr. Rooney said, it's up to us as owners to solve this problem. We have to solve this. And they put together an ownership committee on diversity and inclusion. And in the midst of a busy NFL season, they met every week for 8 weeks. And they said, okay, here's this proposal Cyrus and Johnny have. Do we have something better? And at the end of the 8 weeks, they couldn't find out a better solution. And they said, okay, well, let's go with this. So they adopted that. So what have we seen since that in the years? Well, in the 12 years or so prior to that, there was only 4 minority head coaches hired and 1 general manager, okay? Now in the 12 or so years after, it's 16 minority head coaches and 8 general managers. So it's an 800% increase for general managers, 400% for head coach. And we've done that with our one hand tied behind our back, and that's because we have not had very little help from the colleges, because the colleges have not yet had, although that may change, as Margaret says, they're talking about it, a comparable rule there. And we've done that when there's still a bias about we're going to have minority coaches as defensive coordinators and very few offensive coordinators. It's just the same kind of bias of we can't have an African American be a quarterback, call the plays. We're still seeing that bias on the sidelines of very few minority coaches calling the plays as offensive coordinators. So we're still with those kinds of headwinds against us. We had that remarkable, gigantic success. But what I like to point out, which I think is most telling, is and I know Jan could probably point a lot of studies about this, diversity leads to success to organizations. I mean, there's a lot of data in publicly traded companies and judicial decisions, all kinds of things you can point to. Diversity leads to more success. So what have we shown with the data on the Rooney Rule? That the 12 years or so prior to the Rooney Rule, there was only 1 NFL club that made it to the Super Bowl with a minority head coach or general manager. In the 12 years since, it's happened 10 times, starting with Tony Dungy, who's this year going to be inducted in the Hall of Fame, and Lovie Smith in 2007, leading the Colts and the Bears to the Super Bowl, and Jerry Reese doing it twice as GM of the Giants, Mike Tomlin twice as the head coach of the Steelers, last year Ron Rivera of the Panthers. I mean, if you want to see the power of diversity, just look at this data, because it shows that there's a correlation. So, but it just doesn't happen magically, and this is some of the tools. I'm going to lay out some very specific things I think you can do. The first thing I'm going to turn to Susan, because I know this falls under her bailiwick. We're kind of part of an effort now to really look at what corporate boards of directors governance rules are. In other words, they have rules of things like we need to have independent directors. And as Jan was pointing out, there was like a 0.07 increase or whatever of women on boards of directors. And if we just leave it to that, we're going to be waiting another 50 years to get to parity on that level. So what we're trying to do is saying there are a lot of proxy resolutions along this line right now being instituted, but I want to do it more systematically across all publicly traded companies, is say, look, when you have a vacant position on the board, interview a diverse slate of candidates. Just get people in to compete. Then you've opened up your mind to look at some other candidates. And if we do that, Jan will report in 5 years, hey, we went from 19.2 to 19.7. That's what she could say now. 5 years from now, she'll be able to say, hey, we're at 40%. I mean, it will happen if you just open up the process. This is life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's not about guaranteeing results. It's about guaranteeing an open process to compete. That's all we have to ask for. And so what I'm suggesting as my first recommendation to you is that the Board of Trustees for colleges and universities should say, when we have an open vacancy on the board, we're going to make sure we interview or consider it in a serious way, not the Jerry Jones way, but I mean a serious way, minority and female candidates, people of color, or people of other vantage points, so that we can start to create the cultural change right from the top. And then you can extend that down to the college president level. When we have a vacancy for a college president, we're going to interview a diverse slate of candidates. So that's your first step. But if you even get that rule, that's not enough. What you have to do is have the pipeline ready to go to compete. And so one of the reasons we've been successful with the NFL is that every year we meet with them, and we created a not-for-profit called the Fritz Pollard Alliance that's chaired by John Wooten, who played with the Cleveland Browns in the 60s, and with the great Jim Brown, and is very much an activist. And, you know, he organized that event that people talk about this last week about Muhammad Ali and the conscientious objector. All the athletes got together. John Wooten was there, and he organized that. And that kind of energy he brings today as the chair of our organization. And John was in the front office of the Dallas Cowboys and the Baltimore Ravens, and he knows everyone in the league. So he comes in every December, and we meet with the commissioner, and John comes in with a ready list. Every position that you can conceive of in the NFL, we have minority candidates and sometimes female candidates that can compete for those positions. Club president, general manager, head coach, offensive coordinator, player personnel, you just name the position, we've developed a ready list of candidates. And we vet the candidates before we put them on there, so we know that these are people ready to make it to the next level. And guess what? When they get selected, almost every one of the people we put on that list who was selected to be a head coach has succeeded and got their team at least to the playoffs. So what I think you should do is Susan should get that rule passed for boards of trustees and college presidents. And Kim, you should have the ready list for her. If you do that, you will see the change that you want to see. Because if you just say we want 50% in 2030, it's too easy. It's too easy for a college president to say yes to that. They won't even be on the college president in 2030. You've got to show them the way. Assume that those hundreds of college presidents who sign that are people of goodwill who share the vision. But you have to give them the tools to succeed. And you just do that right there, you will go a long way. Oh gosh, I got 5 minutes. Sorry, I've been talking too much. All right, I'm going to hit some other points very fast. It's always important to have good metrics. So if you're going to have a ready list, you also want to have good metrics. I would be studying how you're going to mentor and develop women candidates so that, you know, they're getting positions on campus that are the kind of feeder positions into college presidents, and they get the mentoring, and Jan mentioned earlier the feedback, that there are affinity groups for women in the pipeline, whether it's on campus or in organizations like this. And I know Kim's doing some of this already, symposium type of things that develop skill sets. And think about one of the biggest drivers of change in corporate America and our settlements, but you have to figure out how you can work it on college campuses, is to get people's attention. We tie in our settlements, we frequently tie senior management and middle management compensation to their performance against metrics on diversity and inclusion. If you could figure out a way to do that on the college campuses, you will get people's attention to kind of take it upon themselves you get the change in the behavior. If we wait around for changing of attitudes, we're not going to get there fast enough. We got to change the behavior. And so anyway, I've been talking too much. I'm glad you gave me that warning, 5 minutes. You can't have a lawyer up here and, you take your risks having us up here.
Be great.
So,
Well, that's fantastic. Let's thank him before we take a question. Willing to take
Yeah,
a couple
take
questions?
whatever
Okay, great. I'm so glad to hear what you've said, by the way, because I feel like the Women's Network is the ready room, right? So anybody we probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions before we take a break and then reconvene for the panel. Lola?
So, this is a conversation, I work in Title IX work, and obviously there's a gender piece to it. But one of the concerns that has been expressed, that a lot of us talk about in higher ed, is that the overemphasis on a regulatory, compliance-based,
Right.
quote-unquote, legal approach to gender violence on campus. I've had people say from different places in the university that it's detrimental to advancing the cause. So I'm wondering, because you're sort of working in that, I think
Right.
it's a real important place for case precedents, et cetera. But I'm just wondering, what's the balance between using a stick versus a carrot in some of these, and whether this impedes some of the sustainability, et cetera. I'm just
Right.
asking in general the regulatory
Sure.
legal.
No, and that's such a big topic right there, but my view from being part of change at so many companies, if you look at issues from a compliance point of view, you don't create change. If you look at it from an opportunity point of view, you create change. Someone has to own these issues. I've also been doing some work on these issues because I've been leading a group to try to deal with some of the issues that happen in the NFL on gender issues. And so that gave me an opportunity to learn a lot from experts around the country. And one of the things that I've been talking to them about in terms of colleges is, for example, have your student athletes, and you could say other leaders on campus, kind of groomed to speak out on these issues, to try to do norm changing. The other key thing I learned, and I think universities are probably the most, and one of the more, maybe Margaret would disagree with this, but one of the more influential organizations in the state, in terms of state government and policymakers, is that we have to deal with these issues from the middle school time period. That's what the science is showing. So by the time you get to college, you've already lost a great opportunity. So if I were university president, what I would be doing is going to my legislature or my leaders in my state to make sure we have character curriculum in the 7th and 8th grades or the middle school grades, that we deal with human development, we deal with these issues early on to get healthy dynamics. So what are the things that are really scary that I learned in the effort I've been doing on the gender work with the NFL is that Celinda Lake, who's a leading pollster, she did a poll of young men in America. She also did a poll of young men in Canada to do a comparison, and she found out that young men, let's say 17 to 25, that 25% of them think using violence to get your way is acceptable. That is off the charts. 5% would be scary. 1% is scary. 25%. So we have a crisis on our hands that we have to deal with at the middle school age. So I just worry that universities are sitting there and dealing with all this stuff. Well, you're public policy advocates. Go to the states and say, make sure that in our state, that our curriculum in our public schools are dealing with these issues.
Great, thank you for that. Shirley, you had your hand up.
One question is maybe to you and to Kim and to all of us is in terms of creating or certifying that ready list, what kinds of things do we do to make sure people are really ready for that other experience? Because a lot of times they're going into places where they're the only one or the first one.
Right.
They're isolated. You know, what do we do to prepare people to sustain themselves in those types of environments?
Do you want me to answer or do you want to do it, Kim?
I would love to hear this.
Okay, well,
what we do, which is on a much smaller scale, obviously, but we have 32 clubs, and we have candidates that are ready, we think are potentially ready to move up. So John Woon, who I mentioned before, what he does, he's on the phone every day. He's on the phone with the potential candidates, he's on the phone with the people at the clubs, and when he puts someone on that ready list, he has verification that this person is ready to go up to the next level from their peers or from other people on the club or from his own judgment. So it takes a proactive effort to see, do they have what it takes to get to the next level? So people who've seen their work, who've seen, I mean, it's, for coaching, it's easy. You can see how they teach. They're teachers, right? How are they in the room with their players? But I think you have to start thinking about what is the profile of what university trustees are looking for when they look for a college president. And the other thing we do, and this is something that Tony Dungy mentioned to me and taught me on this one, is when there's an open position for a president, call that university and find out, well, what is it that they're looking for? And then you pull off people off the ready list that meet that profile. Because otherwise, you don't want to have a mismatch of what they're looking for, right? So you can't quite get to that blind orchestra piece that Jan mentioned, which I love that anecdote. But you can get a little closer if you match up the candidates with what the profile is. But the bottom line is it takes hard work. The ready list takes work.
But I was going maybe sort of like in the rugby direction. And like, so if I look back on my life, one of the things that made it possible for me to survive is that, and this is really funny, 100 years ago I was in the Future Homemakers of America Club. And so in Indiana, that meant that I ended up as a young girl traveling all over the state of Indiana, being the only person of color often in the room. So I was desensitized to that experience and learned how to survive. So that it just became natural that by the time I was on the ready list, I had done that. So that was one of the things I had experienced. And so I wonder sometimes, what do we do in that context to really get people ready for what it's like to be somewhere where they're alone or they're the only one person?
Well, let's take with the college presidents that have already signed on. Ask them who in their direct reports is ready to get to the next level. And then what are they going to do to help get people to the next level? What experiences do they need to do? Because they can take a lot of pride that their provost or their dean of academic affairs made it to the next level, right? So they need to cultivate people and give them the opportunity so they can get there.
It's a great suggestion. We have time for only one more question, so who wants to be it? Linda?
Just a really quick comment, but when you were talking, all I could think about is that this would make a really good movie. And seriously, what way to, get this message out more, and the names of the coaches that you're talking about who are still alive and that people know. This would make an amazing HBO
Documentary.
Well, Kim, I'm going to leave that up to you. You recorded this.
Let's thank Cyrus for sharing these thoughts with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've got coffee and tea outside if you'd like something.
resistant drinker here, so I need to.
Yes, okay, great. So we're going to go ahead and convene our panel discussion. And I think the way that we're going to do this, this session is titled Leading a Movement, Reflections on Successful Strategies and Lessons Learned. So what I think I'm going to do is introduce a couple of questions to Jan and to Cyrus and have them respond to it. And then we'll open it up for questions from the floor, because I think there are, as people have been talking at the break, they've been coming up with some really interesting insights, and I'm hoping that you bring that forward. I do want to explain that because this is being webcasted, I will repeat your questions, and so we want to make sure that we get everybody who's listening from wherever they are has the opportunity to hear your important questions. So I think that in thinking about the comments that have been made so far, I'm really struck by how both of you believe we're at a moment in time when true change is really possible. And I also think that Cyrus's point about the fact that colleges and college campuses and college populations are really poised to be a catalyst for that change, if you'll allow me to borrow your name there, Jan. I think a lot about catalysts for change, but I also think about the fact that these demands for change create a tension on our campuses. And so more and more you have these educational organizations that are expected to be very thoughtful and very deliberate, but the time frame that we have within which to act to demands for change, it seems to me those time frames have become shorter and shorter. If we don't react quickly enough, we could be seen as inattentive or uncaring or tone deaf, as Cyrus said. So as thought leaders and individuals who have tried to create change, when you look at the environment that we're in, and it seems to be that there's this tremendous pent-up demand for change, how do you look at that, and what is your advice to us? Do we resist in the name of being thoughtful educational institutions where we really have to take everything into account before we react? Or do we learn how to adapt and become much more flexible in our thinking and much more open to the idea that we may not have the exactly right answer, but maybe the exactly correct answer is not what's needed at this time? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, because I know this is something that we all deal with here.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts about this. Could you guys hear me? Yeah. The one is I'm a father of a sophomore in college, and well, I guess he'll be a rising junior next year. And my daughter's a rising senior in high school. So I give a lot of thought to what's happening on college campuses. And when my son left for college a few years ago, I said, "You're entering a time when you'll be on a college campus when there's a lot of different viewpoints that are going to be raised, but my worry is that there's almost an intolerance to other viewpoints." So we have to really I think this is the moment where we have to show there's a lot of pent-up energy, right? There's a lot of demand for change, but we have to show as leaders how you bring about change, right? And and part of it is we have to, I think, really emphasize that we're not going to shut down somebody's view because they're less progressive view than our view, that we're going to accept and hear everyone's views. We want a marketplace of ideas. Progressive ideas will probably prevail, but we want a marketplace of ideas. That value, I think, needs to be articulated more. And I know that's hard because as college presidents, people may not even want to hear that. But that's part of our tradition as America. That's part of the First Amendment. That's part of what we've always been about. Second thing and I recommended this to the Pac-12. I spoke to at their conference in May, and they're big universities, so this may be a luxury for bigger universities. But I think that there should be not only a diversity and inclusion officer, but a diversity, inclusion, and engagement officer on campuses. And what I mean by engagement is that someone has to proactively reach out to student populations and hear their issues, hear what's going on. Because I think part of leadership
is making sure everyone is being heard. And so I think that's one kind of practical piece of it. But the other observation I would make in terms of universities of being poised for change, leaders of change, it's not just the student bodies, population, the data I shared with UCLA. The social science research, the data, the academy has all this information. The research that Jan's been talking about, a lot of what that they draw upon is the academy. So the ideas are floating right within the universities, and so I would be kind of trying to use that as a way to catapult some changes.
And I would add to that I think it's always good. Change requires flexibility. So flexibility in your thinking, flexibility in your approach. I agree with Silas about if you can't take in information and you can't hear what people are saying, then you have no opportunity to learn from it. And so that needs to be a tenet of it. But I would also say shrink the change. Start with something you can change. So if you can listen to people, what are the real pain points? What are the issues that are coming up that can be fixed, that don't require 8 weeks of people talking about something to make a change, or years of committee work, but it's a change that can happen. And if you could shrink that change, then that shows the student body, that shows the faculty, that shows the staff of the university that you are committed to making things better. And so don't pass up an opportunity to, do those quick wins, to do something that actually propels momentum.
Great. That's really interesting, quick wins. That leads me to think about this ready list. As opposed to a quick win, a ready list is a very purposeful effort. And as Cyrus pointed out, it takes a lot of forethought to actually prepare individuals. So we try to do that with the Women's Network across the country. We actually try to set the stage for women's progression, and we do that through education, giving them skill building opportunities and activities. But when it comes to actually searching for talent, I guess to some degree we have to turn to those organizations that oftentimes, if you will, position individuals for success, and those are often search firms that we deal with, particularly at the highest levels of higher education. What is your advice to search firms? There might be one or two of them listening today. What would be your advice to search firms about that ready list or ready room idea? What would you suggest that they do, particularly as it applies to positioning women for those leadership roles?
So I would say there's two big lessons there. One, we have seen this in corporations that use search firms for executive leadership, and they have mandated diverse slates from the search firm. So if the search firm comes back to them and says, you know what, based on your criteria, there aren't any women, these companies have said, you're not looking hard enough, and have forced them to go back and do that. We have seen that with some of our Catalyst Award winners. We've heard that from different companies around the world, that they have formed a partnership with the search firm. So they use the search firm as their partner, and they have this shared commitment of what it is they're doing, so the search firm knows when they can expand more, what they're looking for, how to actually make that happen. But then it also comes from something we hear a lot about in board service, and Cyrus alluded to this with the ready list, make sure you know what people are looking for. It's really up to the search firm to make sure people are not looking for unicorns. They can't have every single thing they want. What are the priorities? What are the real key skills and background they need? They cannot have everything, so they have to make decisions. And being able to work, again, with a search firm to be able to provide that guidance, provide that advice, and stop with this ideal candidate, which will have 12 different criteria that, only one person is going to meet, and so that becomes the candidate. So you need to wean off that list. So,
Just to follow up on some of that, there's a new study that came out maybe about a month or two ago that said diverse slates work more effectively if there are multiple female candidates, not just one. So I think that part of that criteria, and I agree with Jen, it's up to the institution to require, that gets back to what I was saying about the Board of Trustees, to require that the search firms are giving you a diverse slate. And I also agree with Jan that the criteria has to be a little bit flexible, because if you just use a very rigid criteria, you may have trouble having that diverse slate, and then you may be missing people. Another piece of the ready list that I forgot to mention earlier is that's led to success in the NFL is that when a candidate goes in and gets interviewed and they're not selected, which of course is going to happen most of the time if you have, because there'll be 5 candidates being interviewed or more. Part of what John Wooten does for the Fritz Pollard Alliance is he calls the decision makers and says, well, what was it that the candidate was missing? And literally, a very famous coach, I can't tell you who it is, he went into one interview and they said, well, he didn't have his staff ready to go. Like we loved him. He's fantastic. He's ready to be a head coach. But he didn't have lined up his staff that he's bringing with him. So we said, okay, that's fine. 2 weeks later, literally, he goes to another interview. He firmed up his staff. He walked out the door as the head coach. So if you have a loop, information loop, how many college president vacancies are there a year? You have to have that ready list, and you have to be in communication with them about their criteria, and you find out what happens in the candidates who maybe don't make it this year, they're going to be selected next year. And so you have to think about that a little bit.
Thank you for that. Jan, you said something very provocative, and I'll bet you there are a number of people in the room who keyed in on it. You said that your research showed that men are promoted on potential and women are promoted on proof. I, for one, would like to hear a little bit more about that, and also, give us an idea, just flesh that idea out a little bit more, and tell us what you believe, just one thing that you believe that we could do as leaders in higher education to push back against that, what I think that we can all recognize as an operating principle for many organizations.
So we've actually seen this at Catalyst, I would say, for more than 20 years. One of our Catalyst Award winners from the early 90s had a story. It was a manufacturing company, and the CEO was really committed to getting more women into leadership. And so every succession planning session, he would be like, where are the women? I want to see more women candidates. And they're all like, that we just don't have enough. They don't have enough skills. They don't have enough background. Finally, he went to a succession planning meeting, same thing, not women being suggested. And he went to every single person there who said, well, you didn't have that skill when you got promoted, so I guess you shouldn't be in this position. And the next person who suggested someone else, he's like, you didn't have any operational skills, you shouldn't be here. And he went down the room and he actually looked to see when everyone was promoted. And they were all looking for this unicorn. They were all looking for a woman to have absolutely everything, whereas they didn't have absolutely everything. So that's a story that really illuminates what we're talking about. And that has to do with relationships and how people know each other. Because men are in leadership, it's easier for them to get to know other men who are coming up. They see them, they think they know them. And in our research, what we found is women had mentors. Women have mentors, it's great, they're getting good feedback. What they don't have are sponsors. They don't have highly placed individuals who are going to champion them. The way we talk about it is a coach talks to you, a mentor talks with you, but a sponsor talks about you. There are not enough people talking about women when they are not there. And that's what I mean about women are not getting promoted on potential. Their potential is not being discussed in the same way that men are. another research study from that same stream of research talked about hot jobs. And those are those highly visible assignments that get you that next role. And in corporations, people like to think they measure everything, they measure finances, they do everything. And so the people who are getting those hot jobs, oh, it should be based on all these criteria. But what we found, it wasn't. It was really based on somebody mentioned their name and other people said, yeah, I know that. I know him. Yeah, he should have this role. But there weren't enough people mentioning women's names. There weren't enough people putting women forward. And so I think a couple of ways to break this cycle is, one, I would advocate if there's a way to do sort of blind, that first initial pool, to do it blind, where you take people's names off their CVs or their resumes or whatever you're having people fill out, so that giant pool can include women. Because as Iris pointed out, there's research that shows it's not one person that makes a difference. When there's enough of them, then you're not comparing them to the bigger group. You're just comparing them to the job. So I do think if you could do that for a pool, that's not for the interview candidate, but just getting people in the pool, if you could just look at it that way. But I also think there's something that would be incredibly helpful, and that is creating a formal sponsorship program. Cyrus alluded to this during his speech about the presidents who have signed on to this. We have a program that's called Women on Board, where we match board directors, sitting board directors, with women who want to be board directors. And we have vetted them. They're ready for that position, but they're not going to get it. And so we match them up with a sitting board director who effectively becomes their sponsor, becomes their introduction to this larger community. And I think that would be incredibly helpful if women had a champion who could talk about them when they're not there.
Great. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I come back to the 300-plus college presidents. You say to them, we need you to get us, prepare our ready list, and then how do you develop those people so they're ready? Then they're going to be thinking to themselves, how do I basically sponsor the person? But I want to come back to what Jan said about hot jobs. That's a really big phenomena. For example, we've done a lot of analysis of like big law firms, for example. You know, people give the assignments to who they trust, they think they trust the most, and then all of a sudden people get these higher profile assignments being accomplished. So if we could turn these 300 college plus presidents to think about a ready list, think about development, think about essentially sponsoring people on their campus to be ready to compete, and give them the hot spot job so they have something to talk about, you'll make a lot of progress.
Before we open it to questions, I guess I have one more question of you, to each of you, to be sure that as we talk about moving the needle and moving women into these leadership roles, is there anything that we haven't asked you yet that you wish that we would have, or that I would have, or you wish perhaps you had been able to say from the podium before we open it up for questions?
Oh gosh, on the spot here. I would say one sort of piece that I didn't really get into because I was talking about inclusion, and that has to do with busting myths and not letting these myths perpetuate themselves, and being able to call them out and being able to break that cycle. A lot of what Cyrus talked about is like what, you know, people usually do and how difficult it is for them to break through. I just was really struck by that whole background about the Rooney Rule and how they had to go off and have these meetings to come up to the conclusion. They couldn't find anything else, and so they sort of backed into it. And I think there is something to be said about being able to present a good case, which is what Cyrus was talking about. Here's the business case. Here's the actual facts in evidence about what's happening. So we can move off this myth and go to what's important, because people are going to stay where they're comfortable. They're going to stay back there. And it's hard to get them to move. And it's not that you're discounting what they believe or trying to change their mind about something, but you're trying to lay it out in a way that that is not going to overtake what you want. And so I would just
Make sure the facts are out there.
Make sure you know what they are, and make sure you know what those myths are that are continually being perpetuated, because I think we don't identify them enough. We talk about unwritten rules a lot at Catalyst. We have research about that. And those don't get identified, and so they just become those informal practices that are in the water that people don't like to call out. And I think it's hard to overcome that if you don't have something to break through that, to help people go down that path you want them to go on, because they're just going to stay where they are.
Thank you.
The one thing I maybe didn't mention earlier that I think is really important is the issue of upward mobility. If you look at what happened with the different tragedies, like Baltimore, Cleveland, Charleston, like all these places where these police issues happened, the zip codes that they were in, like West Baltimore, had the least upward mobility in the whole nation. Okay, so when you look at college students, we have to show them that we're a nation of upward mobility, that there is a future, and that's the whole issue about piling on debt and all this. I think the best way to show that is the things that Jan was talking about, that we're an inclusive environment. You could be a college president. You could be the athletic director. You could be the head coach, that these opportunities are there, and we have to show the way. And I think there's a real sense of urgency on this point that we're an upwardly mobile country where you're going to rise based on merit. And I think the institutions of leadership, which colleges are, have to show that roadmap, to young people.
Excellent. That's a great point. So let's go ahead and take questions, please.
I have a comment and a question. First comment, Jen, thank you for speaking to sponsorship. I know Kim and ACE has done a nice job speaking to as well with Women's Forum and the Spectrum. We need to start talking about sponsorship instead of that. My question is about the Ready List. Love the Ready List. Tell me, if you could, about the pushback. Because what if we have a Ready List? First thing I know is going to happen is we're going to pushback. Who are you to make the Ready List? And what did you respond to that?
So let me just repeat the question. So first, thanks for the idea, Jan, about sponsorship and how different that is from mentorship and how key. And also then, that creation of the Ready List, you're suggesting that you might create a Ready List, but there's going to be pushback on the Ready List. And so your fundamental question is, you love the idea, but how to actually create it and push through the pushback.
Well, I'll just say this. Ask anyone who has that resistance to place a call or send an email to Commissioner Roger Goodell, the NFL. Literally, one of his most important things he does, and one of the things he's most gratified about in his whole 365 days of the calendar, I know the Super Bowl is probably at the top, but somewhere in that better days for him is when we walk in there with that Ready List. He can't wait to see that Ready List. The senior executives of the NFL can't wait to see that Ready List. The club leadership all ask for that Ready List. The owners, the club presidents. So if you do your homework and put together a high quality Ready List, the demand is going to be there. But we have to keep pushing. Like, it's unacceptable today not to interview a diverse slate of candidates. It's such a modest reform. It's such a tiny thing we're asking for. It's not asking for much. And you have to be ready to have and you have to have the Ready List there so they can carry it out.
Andrea?
Yeah, I think we just need to realize that in higher ed, we need to think differently about the readiness. This is a comment more than a question.
Okay.
Obviously welcome the reaction. And so your question, I think, about pushback is very much rooted in the shared governance culture of higher education, as opposed to a corporate or other environment where the hiring takes a very different form. So the question is, how can we think about ready pools of candidates to put forward? And actually, in my experience talking with colleagues from other search firms as well, it's rare that we would need to be persuaded to advance the diversity agenda, but rather we work with our campuses to help advance the diversity agenda there. So we need to think about it in slightly different
So I think that's great, Andrea, pointing out the strengths of the leadership programs that are offered by ACE as well as other national organizations, but also raising the question, is higher education as ready as the NFL for the ready list, and making sure in fact that we are, because of our shared governance structures. It's a different challenge.
It's also, how can we make it work within the structures that we're working within?
That's right. Do you have a comment at all?
Well, for what I would do, I'm not sure. I'd have to really sit down with you a little bit more to kind of get a better feel for where you're going with it. What I would do, and maybe Kim has already done this, I think maybe, is I would look at, let's say, the last 5 years of college presidents being hired. What was their prior job? Now, some of them were probably prior college presidents, but some of them were probably provosts, or find out those positions. Then I would want to know what women are in those positions today. And then I would want to know, what do we have to do to get those women in front of the decision makers when vacancies happen? So it's a lot of like just hard work of nitty gritty, just looking down there. And then I'd want to know, I'd not only have a ready list for college president, I'd have a ready list for provost. I'd have a ready list for those positions that get you to that position, because it's not just the top of the food chain there, it's all the levels that lead up to it.
I would also say, when you talked about the shared governance model, in universities, part of what I was speaking about before was having this shared vision, shared commitment, shared accountability, using that shared governance model to your advantage and making sure all of those groups along the way are on board with this idea. They're ready to champion it for you. They're ready to take it in. They're ready to have this ready list. Like, you want to build that commitment before that list actually appears.
It's a great point, Andrea. Madeline?
I have a comment that I wasn't going to make until you inspired me. But, you know, we talk about pipeline, and one of the ways to consider that, we do these exercises, we call them succession planning, and I'm talking about with a small s, a small p, because we're talking about at the levels that are not ready for the provost and for the president. But if we don't spend 15 to 20 minutes every quarter looking at some talent that we've observed and said, who's our next this? What opportunity can we give to this person, even on a short-term basis, to develop that talent and to give exposure? That's how we get our sponsors. So in succession planning, I guess there might be a better term for it, because again, we usually think of succession planning when a president vacates and what's going to follow, which is all very important. So I'm going to suggest that we think about succession planning all the way up. Just like you said, if you got to start with middle school, we got to start with what our environment is, what our portfolio is, what we have control over, and to make things happen. But here's my question. We've always said that the tipping point, and it comes from the research, I just wonder if it's still the case, that reaching critical mass of about 30%, about a third of whatever is sitting on a board or in a decision-making body, tends to level the playing field, or we're no longer seen as, this representing this group versus that group. There's a somewhat of a healthy balance. Is that still the case, or are you seeing it slip away from us? I would ask that.
Personally, I think critical mass matters a lot for the issue of retention.
Okay.
I don't know how it works in colleges, but I know that in the companies that I look at the data, people of color are just churning through companies big time. And there's, I think part of it is not having enough critical mass. Part of it is a flawed evaluation system. But I don't know, Jen, you know more of the research than I do.
Yeah, so I would say it still is there. That tipping point, having a third of people means they're no longer representing their group. They can be just part of the group that they're in. And I do think getting to that point where people can see, to Cyrus's point about upward mobility, role models, they can see diverse role models, they can see different people who have different experiences, because if they don't see people who exactly match them, people are more likely to be like, well, then I'm never going to make it there. That's not going to be for me. But if they can see people who have diverse backgrounds, diverse kinds of people, they're more likely to say, yeah, that could be me. And that's what you don't want to shut off. You don't want to cut off people's own ambitions, and people's own ambitions are kind of fragile because these death by 1,000 cuts happens all the time. It happens when you're in school. It happens when kids don't get invited to somebody's birthday party and they remember it forever. It happens when you don't get picked in class or your paper doesn't get picked for something in college, and that will go into your work life. And so trying to have a commitment, and that goes back to what is the shared vision? Do you want diversity? Do you want to be seen? And I'm gonna just throw this out here because of our experience of if you don't say what diversity is and you just focus on women, it becomes this weird default of white women are good enough, and it's not true. It's not good enough just to have white women be presidents of universities or in positions of power. We have to have diversity of women in those positions too. So.
That seems to me like that might be a good note upon which to end this panel. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Silas.
Excellent question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we're going to transition to our next speaker. And to introduce her, we have Connie Gores, president of Southwest Minnesota State University and the outgoing chair of the ACE Women's Network Executive Council. Welcome, Connie.
Good morning. Wow, hasn't this just been a phenomenal morning? All sorts of perspectives and things to think about, and this is great. So now we're going to move, so thank you very much this last panel and each of you as individual speakers, and this has just been wonderful. So we've heard a lot about at different levels of working at different levels, working across our universities, across our systems, building the pipeline, being ready, and so on and so forth. Now we're going to talk about succession planning and the role of women on boards, and really take a perspective that will help move us forward in some very, very important ways. Susan Wheeler Johnston is joining us from the Association of Governing Boards of University and Colleges, otherwise known as AGB. AGB. And Dr. Johnston is very talented and skilled, and we're really happy to have her here. She has been in a variety of roles over the past number of years.
Decades.
Okay, well, numbers of years, decades. For instance, she's been in roles similar to a lot of us. She was on college campuses for a number of years. She was the first woman in the English department, and that was probably at Rollins or Rockford?
Rockford.
At Rockford, Illinois, in Illinois, University of Illinois. She was professor of English there. She held a number of administrative positions there, as well as Dean of Academic Development. She also served as Associate Dean of Regent's College in London, England, so brings a different perspective in that regard. In her role at AGB, she works with campuses and organizations on a lot of different kinds of issues: educational quality, college costs, annual governance best practices. She also serves on a number of boards herself, which lends some other perspectives to her work and to her talk today. She's currently a member of the Board of Trustees at Rollins College. She serves as the chair of their governance committee. She's a member of the Board of Visitors at Radford University. She's also she chairs the Board of Trustees at the Southern Education Foundation in Atlanta. She's done a lot of work with the National Survey of Student Engagement, the National Institute on Learning Outcomes Assessment. So I could go on, but as you see, she has many, many different facets to her work and to her life and to her commitments to this work. So I'm very pleased to welcome to the podium Dr. Susan Johnston. Thank you.
Good morning. I am really delighted to be here with you for a couple of reasons. One is that I hope, like you, been the beneficiary of a lot of good leadership and support along the arc of my career, and good policies, I think, that have been in place that have helped me take advantage of opportunities. So I'm happy to be here to be a part of conversation about that. But I am particularly happy that AGB is a part of this conversation, and thank you for including us, Kim, in this meeting. I'm never sure if people in an audience know AGB, so let me just tell you a couple of things. The Association of Governing Boards, our primary members are boards of trustees, and we have about 1,300 boards. They represent over 2,000 institutions, mostly in the United States, but some beyond that. We work with we count among our individual members about 35,000 people, board members, institutional leaders, and other administrators. So it's a good big group of people. And while our focus is governance, it's not governance for its own sake. Our goal is to strengthen higher education and to make sure that what is available to students today continues to be available for students well into the future. We ask board members to be future focused. And while there are many things to draw their attention to yesterday and today, their real job is tomorrow. And I think that's what we're here to talk about as well. What's tomorrow look like? From my perspective, if boards are doing their jobs well in higher education, they're largely invisible. Sometimes they're not invisible, and we read about them in the Chronicle. But I think actually if they're doing their jobs well, you don't notice them. But as a result, I think that can mean that they are invisible when they need to do better. And one of the areas in which they need to do better is in advancing women as leaders. I think that boards should be much more visible on that front. They should be much more engaged, and they should be much more committed to that goal. And so that's what I want to talk with you about today. And along the way, I'm going to touch on a couple of things. One, board governance generally. Two, women on higher education boards. And three, succession planning. So I'm going to start by laying out some facts about the people who serve as board members. And I took a risk here. I have no slides. This is all data. I have no slides, but you are very gifted people. And here's really all you have to do. Visualize a pie. Visualize a third of the pie. And visualize a quarter of the pie. And those are our data points, 1/3 and 1/4. So we'll just talk through that. Even as I give you different percentages, just visualize 1/3, 1/4. So we estimate that there are approximately 50,000 men and women in the United States who serve as members of boards of trustees. And according to our most recent data, and that's from 2015, 32%, that's our third, 32% of all board seats in higher education are held by women. And that's across all types of institutions. That number is up from 12% when we first started tracking the data, which was 1969. So well up from that, thank goodness. And by the way, in 1969, the Saturday Review published an article entitled "The Men Who Govern the Academy." And they really were talking then about these men who governed it. So we are up from 12%. The survey before our most recent survey was 2010, and the percentage of women holding seats on governing boards at that point was 29%. So it has come up, but you know, a third is just a third. Now, I was really interested in the point that you raised about when you get to 1/3, are you at a tipping point? And, you know, I leave that for you to contemplate. I think no, but you can decide what you think about that. A couple of things to note about that 1/3 percentage. It varies according to whether you're looking at public and private institutions and then to institutional type within that. So for instance, for private institutions, the percentage of board seats held by women range from a high of 35% at two-year institutions and a low of 25% for boards of doctoral and research institutions. That's private institutions. For public institutions, all the way around, I think that we see a little more visibility of women in public institutions, both in the president's office and in the boardroom. But for public institutions, the percentage of board seats held by women range from 38% at two-year institutions to a low of 30% at doctoral and research institutions. But we're still kind of in the 1/3 range here most of the time. One big exception that I will draw your attention to, and that is in the public sphere, system boards have the lowest percentage of seats held by women, and that's about 26%. If you think about the role of a system board, it is almost impossible to imagine for me. It is to oversee somewhere between 5, maybe at the low end, 5 institutions to well over 20 or 30 institutions, and all of the students and faculty and staff at those institutions. So huge job, and system boards oversee institutions where the largest number of our students are enrolled. Now, AGB does not track the percentage of women of color on boards, but we do track the race and ethnicity of all board members. And so let me give you that snapshot. And these numbers aren't impressive either. Racial and ethnic minorities account for just about 1/4 of all public board members. It's 23.9%. They, on the private side of higher education, they account for 13.5%. And when you take minority serving institutions out of the mix, with the assumption that their boards are much more heavily populated with racial and ethnic minorities, then the overall percentages of minorities for public boards drops to 17%, and for private boards to 11%. So it's pretty different when you're looking at minority board seats. Let me also give you just a bit of information about board chairs, because I think that's an important position for us to be thinking about. Just as we've seen some movement in the percentage of board seats held by women in both public and private boards, we have seen similar movement among board chairs. And in our most recent survey, 2015, 24%, about a quarter, of the chairs of public institution boards were women, and that is up over a 5-year period. That's up about 7 percentage points, so a pretty good gain. That's for public institution boards. For private institution boards, it's about 23%, so they're very similar, 24%, 23% public versus private, and the percentage increase in the 5-year span for private boards is 3.5%. So we're seeing some movement. Now, I have a theory, and I have no proof, so that makes it the best kind of theory of all. The differences, I think, that we see that are related to gender on public and private boards is the degree of accountability. The visibility of appointments on the public side is greater than the visibility given to appointments in private higher education. And usually appointing authorities are well aware that their appointments will be scrutinized. And so I think that's why we're seeing greater diversity of all kinds among public institution boards, but even then it's not that impressive. Here's my last point about boards. These are volunteer jobs. There's no compensation for serving as a board member. You often don't get your travel paid for. It doesn't matter how far you're going. And you're often asked to give money to be a part of this group. Now, both of those words, volunteer and job, are important. Board members give their time to serve institutions, and I travel around a lot and I talk to a lot of people about boards, and it's pretty easy to talk about perhaps the buffoonish nature of governing boards. Certainly the Chronicle plays up the mistakes, the bad judgment, the problems with conflict, the way that presidents are treated. There are lots of bad stories, and we know from the press in general that a bad story sells better than a good story. There are lots of good stories about board members, so I just want to lay that out there and ask you to accept it. Board members give a lot of time to serve. They aren't, as I mentioned before, they aren't compensated, and they're often asked to give as well. And they're adding their volunteer position to other obligations related to work and to family and to other volunteer things they are committed to. I also said that these positions are jobs. It's hard work being a board member. Is it the hardest job in the world? No, but there are times at which it can feel like the hardest job in the world. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that board members typically come from outside the industry. They are not higher education experts, so they're working in a space that's new to them, and woe be unto the board member who thinks that colleges are just like they were when they graduated in 1968. Higher education itself is undergoing such a tremendous change that not only are board members trying to learn a new industry, they're learning about an industry in flux, which can be very difficult. It's hard to know what you can rely on of old standards and old beliefs and old ways of doing things, and it's just hard to keep up, especially when you consider that board members are on campus 3 to 4 times a year formally, if you're from the private side of higher education, and maybe 6 to 8 times a year if you're from the public side. Third thing that makes this a hard job is that board members are fiduciary. They have legal responsibilities for the institutions that they serve. They can be held legally accountable for action and inaction. So in the past, there might have been a kind of a glory day for the board member, and that's when you could show up, have some cocktails with some nice folks, maybe have a good dinner, see a football game, and then pass some resolutions that have been pre-digested for you. The work has been done, and you simply nod along and give your vote of approval. But those days, if they ever existed, I think those days are gone. So what does that mean? Let me come back to the topic of board governance and women on boards. This is a time of disruption for our industry. No news there. Governance is challenging on top of the leadership of higher education and the work that we all do on campuses. So no board member that I know signs on for that volunteer job because they want to deal with the decline in traditional markets where they've enrolled students, because they love to deal with the declines in state funding or questions about quality or questions about higher education's value proposition and the very real prospect of protests on their campus. Nobody signs on for that. But for many of us, that's the current state. That's our new normal. And that is what boards are being asked to engage on. These are matters of great consequence, and that's where boards ought to live and work, matters of consequence. For some boards, the questions that they deal with are existential, serious, what the future will look like in 5 years or at the end of this one. And for all board members, their work should be strategic. The conversations are often intense, and there are no right answers for their discussion. So the question is how boards can best be positioned to provide the kind of thinking and leadership that's required in this environment. And I think that you know where I'm going on this. The answer is to diversify boards. We know, thanks to Catalyst and others, we know from the research that corporate boards with female members help their companies be more successful than those without women. Those with more women on their boards achieve higher financial performance than those with fewer women. The business case in business is quite clear and well documented, even though there are only 19.9% women holding seats on the Fortune 500 boards. But the business case is clear. To my knowledge, and I'd love to be told that I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, there's no parallel study done for higher education. There is nothing that shows us in ways that matter, that have data behind them, that higher education would derive these same benefits by having more women on its boards. Now, this is not an audience that needs to be told where this value comes from with women on board service. There's a wonderful article by Judy Rosner in Forbes in 2011 called "The Terrible Truth About Women on Corporate Boards." And she said they ask different questions, they're concerned about process, and they complement the attributes of the male colleagues. I would add to that list that they're more comfortable with ambiguity, they listen well, and they play well with others. So why not add more women to boards? In fact, why not add more women to boards in this particular environment where the challenges are great, the answers are not easy to discern, and where the need is so great? And by the way, women account for over 50% of enrolled students at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. So if there's a market interest and a market focus, there's another reason for adding more women to the boards of colleges and universities. Now, one of the most important responsibilities that a board has is recruiting and hiring the president or chancellor of the institution or the system. And again, you know this, the data from ACE's 2011 report on the academic presidency shows that women hold a little over 1/4 of presidencies for all institutional types. So as is the case with the gender of board members, the percentages are a little better among public institutions and among privates, and a little better among two-year institutions than for all other types of institutions. So just to remind you back to the first principles here, about 1/3 of all board members are women, about 1/4 of all board chairs are women, and about 1/4 of all presidents are women. This compares 2011-2015 data, but I think that's fair enough. If you line up ACE's reports on the presidency with AGB's reports on boards, you'll notice two things. Number one, they don't line up because we don't coordinate, which is shame on us. It'd be great if we did. And our next survey is going to be 2020, so maybe we've got time to line these things up so that we actually have some data that we can compare across, because I think that is important, because I think the second thing you'll notice if you line these up is that the growth in the percentage of women presidents lags the growth in the percentage of women board chairs. And if you look at it over time, it's exactly what you see. To me, it tells the story that you need to have more women on the boards to get more women in the presidency. It's something I think you would intuitively figure out. There's no big aha there, but the data show that lag. And as more women join boards, more women become presidents. I think it's another great reason for us to focus this work on the diversity of boards. So let me say a few things about succession planning. It has already come up, and I'm just going to be adding to the conversation. And I'm focusing really, the way I think in my day job, I'm looking at women in the presidency and women in the boardroom, because to me they matter and they come together. Not that others don't matter, but that's where I see a change that can be, we can work on together. Number one, the data show us we're not there yet. Succession planning is needed, but we need succession planning both for presidents and for board members. We need to think about those. Often the conversation is about succession planning in the academy itself, but if we don't get succession planning for boards, we're not going to get the other as fast as I think we can, as effectively as I think we can. The board's role in this succession planning for their own institution is to set expectations and to hold people accountable. They do that. That's their job, and they should be paying attention to, I think, the diversity and expanding the pool of candidates and the people who are selected to hold important positions on their campus. But for boards to do that, they simply need more education, and this is me outing AGB. Our job is to educate board members. This is one of many topics on which we try to educate them. I would assume that board members know this from their own day jobs, that this kind of diversity matters, that it pays off for them in the workplace in one way or another, in a bottom line, in a marketplace, that it pays off. But they also need to understand that it pays off for their institutions and that it pays off in the boardroom itself. And that means including women as chairs. Now, to me, there's a paradox here, and this is what makes this a difficult thing to push forward. Those who can add the impetus to change are also those who need to change. Maybe that's just the way of the world, but board members need to step it up. But they are the people who can help higher education step it up. So they've got to do both things at the same time. Just a little bit of a story from my experience. One board that I joined, when I joined it in higher education, had 10% women on the board and no people of color. I've been on the board now for 6 or 7 years and have worked on this pretty steadily with the board chair, and we've moved that to numbers that still are underwhelming. 20% women and 10% people of color on the board, all intentional behavior, action, thinking on our part. But I have two voices in my ear from this time and this work. One is a board colleague who said, "Don't add any more women to the board, it changes things." And I said, because I couldn't believe it, knowing that this particular board member's really wonderful company targets women. That's who he sells to. I said, "It changes things." "You mean in a good way, right?" And he said, "No, not so much." So that's one voice I have. The other voice I have was the very quiet but focused, mindful, intentional board chair who just kept pushing. He just kept pushing. Now, I want to come back to the idea of the ready list. But for private higher education and for publics, we actually have ready lists for boards. The question is, who do we put on those? Are we putting the friends of the first guy? Or are we putting the people that the second guy, the board chair, thinks would add some good thinking, some talent that we need, some ways of being and thinking that are important? And that's really I think the question for boards. I think we all have these voices in our past and in our present that we need to pay attention to. With AGB, I will just say that our board of directors has been insistent on succession planning, and we've had a powerful board chair who comes from a corporate setting. She calls herself the chief people person within a corporation. She's the HR director of Fortune 500 companies. And the former chair of the board of Spelman College. And she's just added a lot to us by focusing us on succession planning. And so at AGB, every member of our leadership team has identified one or more people who can fill in the gap if needed, can step into that role. And I feel better because of that, and I think we're a stronger organization. I'm guessing that you all have stories that are similar to this. What I would urge us all to do is to be storytellers. We have a lot of data. A lot of our conversation today, including mine, has been about data. But I think that stories have a power that moves beyond data. And I think that if we can all learn to become storytellers about the value of women in leadership positions, I think that we can help move this along. So I wouldn't say set aside the data, but I'd say complement it with compelling stories. So stories stick with people longer than my 1/3 and 1/4. You know, you need both. Now let me just end, because I'm looking at the time. Let me end with what I see as a couple of needs for us. One is this ready list. The pipeline for board seats for colleges and universities. I get asked this question a lot. Does AGB keep a list someplace in some file drawer someplace of people who are ready to serve on boards, in particular women and people of color? And our answer is no. And there are cultural reasons. Higher education is a place of many cultures, you know, and so there are cultural reasons that feels like it won't work. But could it? And I'd ask you to think about that. President of a private college, president of a public university, could you have a ready list that you can take to your governance committee, or you can send to the governor and talk to the governor about, here's what we need, and here's some folks who are ready, willing, and able to serve? The second thing that I think we need is a study in higher education on the impact of diverse leadership. Can we have some data? Can we tell some stories that are drawn from some research? And the third thing I think we need is, and this may sound like it's off a little bit, but I think we need to pay more attention to culture, to board culture in particular. And I think it goes back, Jan, to some of the things that you mentioned. You know, what I watch is when I help move a board from 10% women to 20% women, the women weren't particularly welcomed and made to feel included. Their voices, I knew, were being moderated. And the culture wasn't ready for them. So we have to do many things at the same time, I think. We have to move that needle, the board composition needle, but we have to make sure that the boards are ready for that. And I realize I think I've gone a little bit too long, and I just wanted to stop there, and maybe we could have some conversation.
This is wonderful. Please join me in thanking Susan for her work. Well, I have several questions of my own, but let's go ahead and see what kinds of questions we have here with us today. Yeah, sure.
Susan, at many institutions, they're kind of sub-governing boards. They're the alumni foundation board and the visiting committee and all those types of things, which in many ways serves as a ready list.
Yes.
And I can't remember, does AGB do any tracking of compositions of those kind of subgroups to know if that is kind of a feeder thing would contribute to the advancement of diversity?
It's a good question, and I'd say most institutions, if not all, have these advisory councils of one sort or another, and some schools have many of them. And we do know, sort of anecdotally, but not from hard research, that they are often feeder boards, farm teams, or choose your metaphor, that there is movement from one to the other. And sometimes the movement is, you've completed your term on the board and now we want to keep you, so we're going to put you on the advisory council. But I think what we're really interested in seeing, how can we add to the great diversity that we need on higher education boards by looking at those? It's a great point, and we should do some research on that. But it does work that way.
Good. Lolo.
I think the question I'm starting, thank you, by the way, I love all the presentations, they're so complimentary. The thing that's rolling around in my brain right now is I very much see the value of applying lessons learned from the corporate sector, and I think sometimes higher ed is not always open to that, so I think there's value there. So I want to affirm that I agree we need the studies that are unique to higher ed. And at the same time, I do think there's something different about the higher ed culture, and I thought Andrew was getting at this, which is, you know, for those of us who, you know, studied the higher ed, or I mean, we're organized chaos, you know, it's much less hierarchical, much more diffuse in authority and decision making. It's more networked in the, I realize all organizations are increasingly so, but I think higher ed has some unique things. You know, I was thinking about applying for search. A lot of faculty positions, for example, which is the historical beginning of the pathway to the presidency, department chairs control that. And I think, you know, that it's really interesting how what you talked about in terms of practices would sink down. So I guess I'm just floating around here. I think what I'm trying to get at is there something about, aside from our culture around inclusion, does the higher ed culture itself need to change so that the culture of diversity and inclusion can also be established? Am I making sense in that? Like, I wonder sometimes if the shared governance model is actually a detriment to practice, even though I believe in it very deeply, but I see it disrupt a lot of change that's positive, because we get this tyranny of one, and we can't all focus the compass in the same direction.
I agree that the shared governance in particular, I think, poses some problems for the kind of succession planning that you would see in a corporate setting, for instance. That's just not acceptable because it excludes what I would consider as important voices in choosing, or not, maybe not in formally choosing, but in supporting candidates for leadership positions. I think that is important in the culture of higher education. So we've got another, I think, conundrum. You know, how do we make it happen? I think we can make shared governance work and still have succession planning, as long as we're very clear and open about we are doing succession planning. It is for the benefit of the institution, and you know, we hope to have these kinds of outcomes. And people aren't surprised by succession planning.
Margaret.
So I have a success story. At Harvard, we've moved our board to 51% women.
Congratulations.
I'm very pleased about, because that took some very purposeful effort. So that's just to tell you that I know that can be done, and I understand, you know, what needs to happen in order for it to be done. But I have a question for you about AGB. Even though you don't have a study that shows that diverse leadership in higher education really does make a difference, to therefore convince other trustees that it does make a difference, you have a remarkable platform from which to speak, and you have the corporate data that you could convey. Is AGB thinking about making this maybe a topic of a trusteeship magazine where you talk about the possible transfer of capability? What can we learn? What can higher education learn from corporate boards? And I think that a lot of boards would be surprised. I think many boards don't see themselves as exclusionary, and I think they'd be surprised at how widespread the inequity is in terms of membership. I'm just curious about whether you might consider doing a special issue on this.
I think that's a good idea. At our national conference this last April, just a few months ago, we actually had a panel of two guys, Dick Chait, well-known on higher education governance, and Jeff Sonnenfeld, well-known on corporate governing boards. And their goal was for them to talk about lessons that, can move from one to the other and help higher education get the best of what you could know from corporate governance. And if you know these two personalities, it will not surprise you to learn that they just could not settle down and talk about it, and they were all over the place with other topics. So we never got to that point. And I have asked specifically for an article to be written for trusteeship on this point of, what are the good practices that we can learn. But I don't think that the magazine itself is sufficient. I think we need more than that, and I think we need larger work. AGB issues what we call board statements on important topics, board statements on intercollegiate athletics, board statements on completion, board statements on educational quality, and we are looking at the possibility of doing one on this general topic of board diversity. Because I think we need a national presence on it a little bit to see if we can move it forward.
It's great. I'm glad you're considering that, because I do think that people will listen to AGB, and whether it's through trusteeship or, one of your very well thought out thought pieces, which you issue from time to time on different topics, it would be great if you could do one on this.
Thank you. We'll do that.
I
that's
would
good.
add to that, if there was a partnership with ACE, so we could look at the academy both at the board level and the presidency level, and see if there's a translation from what Catalyst tells us, for example, about organizational benefits of having a diversified and inclusive leadership. If it applies to the academy, it's, it would change the narrative.
It would. That'd be a win-win.
Not just piecing it, but to actually, because people need to cite it and they need to quote it, and we don't have those data. So we borrow it.
That'd be great. Liz? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, they can't hear it otherwise? I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. This is Liz from TIAA. And I was at that conference, and I did hear that session between corporate and the higher ed. And you're exactly right. I went so far back and forth. It was a great session. So I have a comment and then a question for you. My comment is taking those corporations that are exemplary examples of corporate, where we actually have moved the needle, where we had that systemic diversity and inclusion. And I can tell you, I'm proud to say that TIAA is one of those corporations. And we spend exorbitant amounts of time, resources, energy to make sure that is part of our culture every year. It's not a one and done. It's something that we're doing all the time. So that's my comment. My question, though, is Susan, for you, when you talk, and I actually am thinking that this is for the presidents too, I always have to tie it back to, follow the money. The money is where the power is, right? And women are actually going to be in control and actually are already making 85% of all financial decisions. So I feel like there's this gap between kind of, I think of boards and their important fundraising, fiduciary, the whole works as far as the financial well-being of the institution, and women, and kind of not bridging that gap, even though we're very, very capable. So my question is there anything that's happening in that realm around fundraising, managing the assets of the institution, all of those important topics, and bridging that gap with women?
So the question really is around the importance of managing finances and really being attentive to those issues, and the fact that many women do that, and like you said, 85% of the women handle finances, so on. What's the connection there between those responsibilities and board development and boards and leadership and so on?
Well, let me just tell you one quick little story. At another AGB meeting, and this was probably 10 years ago, we had a big plenary session on philanthropy and had some big donors, some foundations, big folks talking big ideas. And they came to the end, and it was time for questions, and no one was asking a question. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm a staff member. Somebody's got to start this conversational ball rolling. So I jumped up and asked a question, which I thought was a softball question, which was, can you talk about women as philanthropists? Dead silence. They had nothing to say. They hadn't even thought about it. Well, that was 10 years ago, and I hope that the same people, if asked today, would have different questions, different answers, or be able to address that. What you have raised are some of the key points that boards have the greatest anxiety about financial acumen. Do we have what we need on our board? About handling investments, about philanthropy. And, to get, just my experience, to get the kinds of folks with the skills that are needed on these boards, we've got to look at women who have this ability. And it is actually one of the first places I find to make a comfortable insertion of women into boards, where they're otherwise perhaps resistant. If you can bring in women with, evident ability, the guys on the board sit up and pay attention. And that's one easier way in that I've found.
Okay, we have one more question. Cyrus?
I was just going to pick up on what Liz was saying here. If you want to look at this from a kind of business point of view and sustainability point of view, if the academy can show leadership, Margaret was saying Harvard thankfully is 50% women board members. If you could show leadership in the sense that we're going to be an inclusive environment, we have an open vacancy for the college president, we're going to have a diverse slate for provost all the way down. The message you want to send that to is to the prospective parents who are very much involved in where their kids go to college. I mean, that's the marketplace. More than half of the student body are women. Who do you think who's very much involved in making the decisions of where, a lot of parent families are single parent families. So, I mean, if you want to improve your data points in terms of your key area, which is recruiting students to come to your school, it's a great market.
So the point he made was to tie this work to the communication that we have, the messages we give, the stories we tell about, and to whom we tell about the value of college education and the value of board work and so on, especially since so many of us help guide our children to colleges. Women do this in particular, and all the different roles that we play. Good. I'm sorry, I know we have other questions in the audience, but you'll have to find Susan privately, please, and ask her those questions. So join me in thanking her for her remarks. Thank you. And I'm going to turn the program back over to Kim Bobby, because our next item is lunch, and she'll tell us how that works. Thank you.
Okay, as Connie said,